I was shocked when I went out for coffee before going to work and found my wife and her lover together at the corner table, drinking coffee and laughing. It wasn't just any laugh. It was the kind she used to keep for me. She laughed with her eyes narrowed and her hand over her mouth, as if she were trying to hide her happiness. Only now, it wasn't for me. And even though my chest was torn apart inside, I remained calm. I took my cell phone out of my pocket, aimed, and clicked. I photographed that scene. Her cup was still steaming. His hand brushed her wrist intimately. She tossed her hair to the side as if she wanted to be noticed, like she did on our first dates. There, right in front of me, my entire marriage was crumbling without a sound, as if it had been built on sand. I walked home in silence, with the lumps in my throat heavier than any words I could say. I waited. I waited for the sound of the key turning in the door. I waited for the smell of her perfume to waft down the hallway. I waited for the exact moment when she would look into my eyes and understand that something was different. She arrived smiling, as if nothing had happened. As if that morning was just like any other. But it wasn't. When she asked me how my morning was, I answered with another question: "Who did you have breakfast with today?" Her face instantly paled. The words disappeared from her mouth as if they had never existed. I showed her the photo. Her silence was louder than any scream. And before she could say anything, I threw two words on the table that she never expected to hear: divorce and custody. It was at that moment that she realized that this was not just a mistake, but the consequence. Not a thoughtless choice, but a conscious destruction. She tried to deny it, stammered, invented, distorted. She said it was just a friend, that I was exaggerating, that it was all out of context. But the image spoke louder. The image screamed. "Are you going to destroy our family over a cup of coffee?" she asked, as if I were the one to blame. As if my pain was less than her thirst for something new. The betrayal wasn't just physical. It was emotional, slow, premeditated. Her gaze hadn't been mine for months. The way she avoided contact, the way she said she was tired, the way she avoided my touch. It all made sense now. Every silence in the early hours of the morning. Every message she said was from her friend. Every muffled laugh in the bathroom. It was all part of a farce that I refused to see. And when I finally opened my eyes, it was too late. But what she never expected was that I wouldn't beg. That I wouldn't cry. That I wouldn't ask her to stay. Instead, I left her with the weight of her own choices. And that's when her world began to fall apart. It wasn't my pain that made her come to her senses. It was the contempt. It was the silence. It was seeing that I wasn't willing to share the past with her, much less the future. She came to me days later, with swollen eyes, saying that she made a mistake. That it was just a mix-up. That she loved me. That she didn't know what she was doing. But the problem is that she knew exactly what she was doing. She just didn't think I would have the courage to react. To move on. To pick up the rubble of what she destroyed and build something else on top of it. Something better. Something real. The most ironic thing is that her lover left the moment the truth came out. He didn't want any commitment or involvement. It was just fun, he said. She was left alone. Without me. Without him. And little by little, without her children too. Because they saw everything. They understood. And they made their own decision. Children feel when something is wrong, even if they don't fully understand. And when they realized that their mother was no longer part of the home, they distanced themselves. She tried to change things. She tried to rebuild. But it was too late. Because regret is a slow poison, it eats away at you from the inside, little by little, and there is no cure when what has been lost is respect. Life went on. And, in the midst of so much pain, I found shelter where I least expected it. In an unpretentious reunion. In a simple conversation. In a look that saw me without judgment. In someone who was not there to fill a void, but to share something new. Someone who knew how to wait for the healing time. Who didn't want to be anyone's replacement. Who fell in love with my scars and not with the promises. And it was at that moment that I understood, her betrayal was not the end of my story. It was the beginning of my freedom. But the real turnaround was yet to come. Because even after everything, even after the separation, the apologies, the belated regrets, she didn't give up. She started going to the same places as me. Sitting in the same coffee shops, as if she were trying to redo that day, only in reverse. She watched me from afar. She waited for me to see her. For me to smile. For me to come back. And one of those mornings, she saw me laughing. The same way she laughed at the table with him. Only now I was laughing with someone else. A real woman. And it was there, at that moment, in that coffee shop, in that same corner, that she understood that the world doesn't revolve around regret. It revolves around consequences. What happened after that, I didn't even expect. Because sometimes fate saves its most brutal twist for the moment when the traitor believes he can go back. But not every story can be replayed. And not every love survives neglect. But what did she do after seeing me there, with another woman, in the same place where everything started to fall apart? What was she capable of doing when she realized she lost everything, including herself? That answer, only the end of the story can provide. Welcome to the channel. Here, we do not romanticize and never support any form of betrayal. All the stories you hear are fictional, but built to show, with realism and intensity, how betrayal is capable of destroy lives, families, and true feelings. Each narrative is a warning, a mirror and, above all, a lesson. Get ready to listen now, a shocking story, which will stir your emotions from beginning to end. Her name was Laura. And from the first moment she met Daniel's gaze, something in the air seemed to rearrange itself, as if their lives had been silently preparing for that encounter. She was a literature teacher at a private school, known for her sensitive and poetic way of seeing everyday life. He was a civil engineer, methodical, focused, with a subtle sense of humor that appeared when least expected. They were opposites in essence, but compatible in what mattered. It wasn't love at first sight, but an immediate, silent connection, built over time, made up of small exchanges and attentive glances. The kind of love that doesn't explode all at once, but warms up little by little, like coffee left on a low heat so that the flavor doesn't burn. When they decided to get married, there were no big parties, no promises made to impress. There was only the calm certainty that one completed the other's silence. The apartment they chose to live in wasn't big, but it had large windows that let in the morning sunlight, and a small balcony where Laura liked to tend to the plants. Daniel, on the other hand, knew little about gardening, but he pretended to be interested just to hear her talk excitedly about the species and their peculiarities. In the late afternoons, it was common to see them there, sitting side by side, sharing tea, laughing about silly things, discussing the script of a film or commenting on her students and the projects he was developing. Life, at this stage, seemed to be going just right. They had 2 small children, Samuel and Clara, who brightened up the house with their voices and clumsy steps. Their daily lives were full of routine, but also of small gestures of care, a ready-made lunch in the fridge, a note stuck to the mirror, a kiss in the middle of a sentence. It wasn't a perfect marriage, but it was a home. As the years went by, Daniel began to work more. Bigger projects required more time away, and he would often leave before sunrise and return when the children were already asleep. Laura, on the other hand, stuck to her routine at home and at school. The routine with the children, the school commitments, the family dinners that were sometimes just her and the little ones. Still, there was a silent understanding between the two. They didn't demand daily declarations, nor did they demand exaggerated proof of affection. They believed that love was sustained by well-explained absences, repeated choices, and daily commitment. Even when time was tight and the days became more tiring, there was still room for silent hugs and knowing looks. There was a mutual security, an idea that they were together for the right reason. Mutual friends used to say they were an inspiring couple. And maybe they were. They had a mature relationship, without games, where each person knew their place. Laura was detail-oriented, sweet, and had a keen sensitivity to notice what no one said out loud. Daniel, more reserved, was the kind of person who showed love by fixing the faucet, carrying heavy bags, or staying up to wait for his wife to get home from work at night. He didn't talk much about what he felt, but he showed it with actions. For him, caring was loving. And for her, listening was loving. And in that, they found balance. Weekends were reserved for the children, for walks in the park, visits to the library, and afternoons of board games. There was a silent tradition of making family breakfast on Sundays, with pancakes and fruit cut into funny shapes. Their marriage went through phases. Good phases, lukewarm phases, phases of doubts disguised as tiredness. But in all of them, Daniel believed he was safe. It never crossed his mind that something could break what they had built. Laura, on the other hand, began to change in small ways. Nothing blatant. Nothing that could be accused of. Just a slight distraction in her eyes, a longer delay in responding, an invisible absence even when she was present. Daniel attributed it to stress, to the demands of everyday life, to the natural wear and tear that any relationship suffers over time. He was never one to be paranoid. He was practical, rational. He trusted. And trust, in many cases, is the most blinding thing. The school where Laura taught was traditional, with an old faculty and well-defined routines. She loved what she did. She had a passion for words and the way she could touch students through the stories she told. Sometimes she would come home inspired, wanting to share a quote or a piece of work that had moved her. Daniel would listen to her, even when he was tired, even with his head in spreadsheets. He knew how important that was to her. And so he never complained. On the contrary, he always encouraged her. During the holidays, they would often take short family trips, simple destinations, but full of meaning. They would take games, books, and return with memories that seemed to last forever. The photos scattered around the house were witnesses to authentic moments, sincere hugs and spontaneous smiles. Laura always had a more intense social circle. She was more open, more communicative. She participated in teacher meetings, coffees with friends, pedagogical meetings outside of working hours. Daniel trusted her. He always trusted her. He never invaded, never questioned, never needed to follow any trail. He found this invasive, unworthy of a relationship like theirs. There was a dignity in love that he believed was inviolable. Laura was intelligent, sophisticated in her simplicity, and he admired her for that. Even after years together, he still found it beautiful the way she wrinkled her nose when she laughed or how focused she was when grading tests in the living room. Sometimes he watched her from afar and thought how good it was to have found someone who understood him even in the silences. As their children grew up, the challenges of their life together intensified. Clara began to struggle at school, and Samuel became more introspective. Daniel tried to divide his time between work and family commitments, but he couldn't always be present for everything. Laura seemed to handle everything with silent strength, but sometimes, when she thought no one was looking, her expression would disappear for a few seconds into the void. There was tiredness in her eyes, but also something else. Something he couldn't name. Something that passed like a whisper between the cracks of his routine. Over time, the intimate moments diminished. The once long conversations became more practical, more objective. Who would pick up the children, who would pay the bills, who would schedule the next school meeting? But even with the lack of romance, there was respect. There was a solid foundation built over years of mutual dedication. The children were happy, the house was welcoming, and everything seemed to be in order. But sometimes order hides chaos. And love, when not cultivated in the details, becomes invisible. Daniel believed he was fulfilling his role well. He worked hard, was faithful, and tried to be a present father. He thought love was about surviving everyday life without unnecessary drama. Laura, on the other hand, seemed increasingly silent. And he, believing that silence was peace, never realized that it could also be distance. The nights, once filled with movies and conversations, were now filled with cell phones, reports, distractions. The messages became shorter, the kisses quicker, the hugs more formal. But he didn't see any problem with that. He saw it as part of adult life. Of routine. Of real marriage, without fantasies. He thought that passion transformed over time, that the fire at the beginning turned into embers, and the embers were enough to warm him. He never wanted more than that. He wanted stability, security, continuity. Laura, perhaps, wanted something more. But she didn't say it. She didn't complain. She didn't ask. She just distanced herself a little more each day. And Daniel, too busy, too distracted, didn't see it. In everyone's eyes, they were a model family. Neighbors admired them, colleagues praised them, friends quietly envied them. But inside the house, between the walls, something was starting to fade. Slowly. Silently. Irreversible. And the cruelest thing of all is that, even with all the signs, Daniel continued to believe he had everything under control. Because sometimes, the purest love is also the blindest. And when you truly love, it takes a while for us to realize that the other person is no longer there. Even if you sleep next to us every night. Even if you smile in photos. Even if you say you love us. The heart knows. But the heart sometimes refuses to accept. And so it was, with the house still full of children's laughter and synchronized routines, that the story began to change. Without noise. Without warning. Like a storm that forms on the horizon while everyone still believes it is just another cloudy day. Daniel began to notice the changes like someone who notices the wear and tear on an old painting, not sure when the colors began to fade. It was subtle, but present, like a constant echo of something out of place. Laura no longer said goodbye with the same touch on the shoulder, she no longer smiled with her eyes when talking about the day, and family dinners began to be filled with long silences. The words that used to flow between them like a calm river began to stumble into short, dry sentences, as if each had become a guest in the other's house. Still, Daniel clung to the daily routine, believing that this was part of adult life, that after so many years it was natural for there to be a certain wear and tear, a certain distance. He didn't suspect it. He didn't want to suspect it. And maybe, deep down, I feared more than I knew. The days piled up. Laura seemed more and more distant, but busy. There was always a new educational project, a new meeting, a new training session at another school unit. Daniel, committed to his deadlines and responsibilities, tried to fill the empty spaces with his children, believing that keeping the little one's routine intact was a way to sustain the family structure. The children still seemed happy, still laughed, still looked to their parents for affection and security. And it was for them that he insisted. It was for them that he continued to believe that, despite the detours, they were still on the right path. It was on a normal morning that everything really started to change. Daniel always left early for work, with the habit of stopping at the same cafe before facing the traffic and the fatigue of the construction. That day, however, something made him go back home. A trivial oversight, the keys to the office, left on the dresser in the bedroom. He hurried back, entered quietly so as not to wake the children, went upstairs and, as he passed the living room window, saw a scene that seemed to have been taken from a nightmare he never thought he would experience. Laura was leaving the building with light steps, too dressed up for the school routine, with a strange sparkle in her eyes and a smile he had not seen for a long time. She walked to the other side of the street, where a car was already waiting for her. Daniel remained still, without breathing, watching her get into the car as if she were entering a secret. The driver? A man, who greeted her with a kiss on the cheek and an intimacy that was impossible to ignore. The car drove off, and Daniel stood there for long minutes, with the keys still in his hand, feeling the ground move away from under his feet. For days, he tried to pretend he hadn't seen it. He tried to convince himself that there could be an explanation. But the image repeated itself in his mind like a dull blade, her smile, the lightness of her steps, the way she placed her hand on the other man's arm. He began to pay more attention. The times didn't match anymore. Excuses multiplied. There were different smells on her coats, subtle traces of a perfume that wasn't hers or anyone she knew. A different lipstick forgotten in the sink. A muffled laugh on the phone. Small absences that gained weight. And then, the certainty grew. A certainty that he didn't want to have, but that he could no longer ignore. He decided not to confront her right away. He wanted proof. He wanted to know how far she would go. He wanted, perhaps, to understand why. He began to observe coldly. He became a spectator in his own marriage. Laura, oblivious to the suspicion, continued to live normally. She took care of the children, prepared dinner, and carried out family rituals with precision, but without soul. Daniel began to write down schedules, record absences, and save loose messages he found on the computer that she, through carelessness or blind trust, sometimes left open. And each piece he found was a new wound. A loose sentence. "See you tomorrow, my love," that was not meant for him. An "I loved you yesterday," written with affectionate punctuation and hints of desire. It destroyed him inside, but he did not want to act on impulse. He wanted her to reveal herself. He wanted her to say, in her own voice, what he already knew. That Friday, he went out as usual. But this time, he decided to come back earlier than usual. Something was driving him. A strong, heavy intuition. He stopped at the local cafe, where he usually spent his mornings. He ordered his usual. He sat by the window. And that was when he saw her. Laura. In the same cafe. At the same table in the corner that they used to frequent in the first years of their marriage. With the same smile. But with another man. The same man from the car. They laughed. They touched each other. They shared the same dish. Her hands rested on his arm as if it were habitual, natural, intimate. Daniel remained motionless. His heart was beating like a muffled drum. There was no more doubt. There was nothing more to investigate. He took his cell phone out of his pocket. He recorded the scene. Not to spread it around. Not for revenge. But so he wouldn't doubt it later. So he wouldn't let her distort reality. He left the cafe without being seen. He got into his car. He took a deep breath. He felt everything inside him crumble. The promises. The Sundays. The family pancakes. The birthdays. The sleepless nights with his sick children. It all seemed like a lie now. Or worse, it seemed too real for what he was seeing. He arrived home before her. He organized things as if nothing had happened. He played with the children. He prepared dinner. He waited. And when he heard the sound of the key turning in the door, he knew it was time. Laura came in smiling. She was carrying a bag, as if she had just come from the market. She asked how the children were. She kissed her son. She sat down on the couch. And then Daniel came closer. He took his cell phone out of his pocket. He showed her the photo. He didn't say anything. He just watched her face fall apart in seconds. Her smile disappeared. Her body stiffened. Her breathing faltered. She tried to speak. She searched for words. She said it wasn't what it seemed. That there was an explanation. But there wasn't. And he, for the first time, spoke firmly. He asked her to stop. Not to make a fool of him. To at least respect his pain. Laura began to cry. A desperate, confused cry, full of guilt. But Daniel was cold. Warm on the inside, but cold on the outside. He said he wanted a divorce. He said he wanted custody of the children. That he wouldn't accept anything less. That she could have everything, except them. Her expression changed. Desperation turned into pleading. Tears turned into words thrown out quickly, trying to save something. But there was nothing left to save. And in that moment, seeing the man she loved before her like a stranger, like someone who no longer belonged, she understood what she had done. It wasn't just a betrayal. It was the end of everything. The end of the story they had written together. But there was something Daniel didn't know yet. Something that would change everything. A secret that wasn't on that coffee table, nor in the messages read, nor in the words spoken that night. Something that Laura had been keeping from the beginning. Something that, when revealed, would not only justify some of her actions, but would put the whole story in a new perspective. And that truth, still invisible, was about to come to light. Laura spent the next few days as if she were living in another time, a parallel dimension where the past weighed more heavily than the present and the future was a distant shadow. The tears that once seemed to soothe her were no longer useful. There was no comfort, no answer. Daniel's silence was a blow she hadn't expected. He didn't shout, he didn't destroy anything, he didn't insult her. He just walked away. And this distance hurt more than any fury. He slept in the guest room, looked after the children with calculated delicacy and passed her in the hallways as if avoiding a stranger. Laura tried to be present, tried to make up for it, tried to speak, but no words were heard. The excuses, the arguments, the attempts to justify the unjustifiable fell apart before they even left her mouth. She felt like everything was falling apart in slow motion, and the worst part was knowing that she had no one to blame but herself. Daniel, on the other hand, maintained a self-control that surprised even him. Inside, there was a confusion of feelings that silently collided: anger, sadness, disgust, disbelief, shame. But there was also a growing coldness. A kind of clarity that only intense pain can provide. He observed Laura with the eyes of someone seeing her for the first time, and this new vision was cruel. Because the more he looked at her, the less he could see in her the woman he had once fallen in love with. He tried to understand why, tried to find a moment when he had made a mistake to the point of justifying it. But nothing made sense. And the more he thought, the stronger the need to distance himself and his children from all of this became. On Saturday afternoon, a week after the revelation, Laura insisted that they talk. She waited for Daniel to return from an outing with the children and, in a low voice and with visible nervousness in her gestures, she asked him to listen to her. He stared at her for a few seconds, then nodded. They went to the living room. The children were upstairs, busy. The tension in the air was thick, as if any false move could detonate a bomb. She began by saying that she knew she had hurt him deeply, that there was no possible justification, but that she needed to tell the truth. Daniel didn't answer. He kept his gaze fixed, attentive, as if preparing to hear something he didn't want to hear, but needed to. Laura took a deep breath, clasped her hands in her lap, then looked up, visibly trembling, and let out, almost in a whisper, the sentence that would change everything: that man Daniel had seen her with at the cafe, was not just any lover. Daniel's blood seemed to run cold. His eyes widened, as if his whole body had understood before his mind. Laura continued, with tears in her eyes, saying that this had not started as a romance. It had been a reunion, a coincidence. A man from the past, who had resurfaced at a pedagogical conference, and with whom she had had a brief relationship before meeting Daniel. At the time, she was young, impulsive, and it had not lasted more than a few months. He was married. They drifted apart. Each went their own way. Years later, this man came back to her. First with innocent messages, then with quick encounters, until they became too frequent to seem casual. Laura said that she resisted at first, but there was something about that return that confused her, that stirred memories, needs that she did not want to admit. And then, with a heavy gaze, she revealed what Daniel would never have imagined. That man, the one she smiled with at the coffee table, was also Samuel's biological father. Daniel felt the ground disappear. His breath hitched. He tried to process what he had heard, but he couldn't. He stood up abruptly, walked in circles, squinting as if he could erase it. Laura stood up too, approached him, tried to touch his arm, but he recoiled as if protecting himself from a burn. She said she didn't know when it came to light, that the man only raised the hypothesis years later, when he saw a photo of the child. That he had asked for a DNA test, which she had resisted, but in the end she had given in secret, and the result was indisputable. Samuel was his son. Daniel staggered, as if he had been hit by something physical. His face looked different, there was no longer coldness, only devastation. He sat on the couch, weak, his hands on his face. All he could think about was the boy. The son he had raised since his first cry. The boy he taught to ride a bike, who he carried on his shoulders on birthdays, who got sick and only slept on his chest. It wasn't just a marital betrayal. It was a betrayal of fatherhood, of the purest love he knew. And all of this had been hidden, silenced for years. Laura knelt before him, crying uncontrollably. She said she had discovered the truth too late, that she had been afraid, that she had tried to pretend she didn't know, that she preferred to believe that Daniel's love for Samuel was stronger than any biology. But when the other man appeared, she lost her way. She gave in. She wanted to experience something she believed she had lost. But she never thought he would demand to be part of the boy's life. That he wanted recognition, that he wanted what was his. Daniel exploded. He screamed with a pain that mixed everything together. He called her a coward, a selfish woman, a destroyer. He asked her how she had the courage to let him fall in love with another man's son without telling the truth. He asked her if she imagined the extent of the violence that this represented. He said that all of this was more than betrayal, it was an emotional mutilation. And she cried, begged, said that nothing would change who he was to Samuel. That he was the real father, the only one, the one who had always been there. But Daniel couldn't hear. The world seemed to spin. The memory of all the moments with his son passed by in flashes, the first, Daddy, the hugs, the drawings made at school. Everything was now contaminated by a doubt, a new, immeasurable pain. He stood up. He said he didn't know what he was going to do. That he had to get out of there. That he couldn't look at her without feeling sick. Laura tried to stop him, grabbed his hand, but he pulled away. He crossed the room, opened the door, and left. He walked aimlessly. The cold from the street cut through him, but he barely felt it. All he felt was his heart breaking into 1,000 pieces. And in the back of his mind, a single, insistent question: how could he continue living with such a big lie? How could he look at his son and pretend that nothing had changed, when everything inside him screamed that the world would never be the same? As he walked, silent tears streamed down his face. He wasn't just crying over Laura's betrayal. He was crying over the destruction of a pillar that had supported his life, fatherhood. He was crying because he had loved deeply, because he had devoted himself without reservations, and yet it hadn't been enough for the truth to be told. And now, faced with the revelation, there was only one certainty: nothing would ever be the same again. And what he would do with that, he still didn't know. Daniel walked to the car as if his steps were not his own. The steering wheel in his hands felt like a strange object, too hard to hold and too soft to let go. He had no destination. He was just driving. The sky was cloudy, but he didn't notice the clouds, he didn't see the buildings passing by, he didn't feel the weight of the rain that was beginning to touch the windshield in thin, spaced drops. Everything was silent. A dark silence that came from within, filling every corner of his mind. When he finally stopped the car, he didn't even realize where he was. An empty parking lot, near the children's school. He sat there, without knowing for how long. He just stared straight ahead, his hands trembling on his thighs, as if his body had forgotten how to function. Samuel's name came and went like a wave cutting through his flesh, and with it came images, voices, smiles, small memories that, until a few minutes ago, had been sacred memories. Now, each one of them hurt like needles. It wasn't because of the child. It was because of the weight of the lie. It was because of the time that was stolen from him in silence. Because of the love that was taken for granted, but not true. And more than that, it was because of the fear that all of this could change the way he looked at his own son. Hours passed. When he decided to go back, night had already swallowed the day. The house was dark, except for the light in the kitchen. When he opened the door, he saw Laura sitting at the table, her eyes swollen, with an untouched glass of water in her hands. She didn't get up. She didn't say anything. She just looked at him. He crossed the room slowly, stopped a few feet away from her, and stood there, breathing deeply. After several long seconds, he spoke, without anger, but with a pain that trembled inside. He said that she needed to understand what she had done. That truth was not hers alone. That it never was. That keeping it a secret didn't protect her, it only destroyed everything. Laura listened, crying silently. She said that she didn't know how to tell him, that she was afraid of losing everything, that she had convinced herself that hiding it would be the best way. He asked if the other man really wanted to get into Samuel's life. She hesitated, but said yes. That after the DNA test, he started to pressure her, saying that he wanted to assume paternity, that he had rights. Daniel squeezed his eyes tightly. It was too much. It was like being pushed down a flight of stairs with your feet tied together. She said she would never let Samuel know that way. That, for him, nothing would change as long as he had a choice. Laura tried to argue, tried to say that the boy had the right to know who his biological father was. But Daniel interrupted her. He said that fatherhood was much more than blood. That any idiot could father a child, but few had the courage to truly love one, to wake up at 3 a.m. to bring down a fever, to spend the night by his bedside after a nightmare, to celebrate every achievement, to hold on tight in moments of failure. And that, no matter how betrayed he felt, he had never stopped being a father. And he wouldn't let him. But there was no more room for her by his side. Laura fell silent. There was something in her that seemed broken. Her voice trailed off, her gaze fixed on nothing. As if, at that moment, she had realized that everything was truly lost. The next morning, Daniel woke up early and went out with the children. They went to the park, had ice cream, and played ball. He tried to act natural, but inside he was fighting against the dizziness of everything that was happening. He watched Samuel more intensely than ever. Every gesture, every laugh, every feature. He was looking for something. A clue. A trace. And he found nothing but the boy he had always loved. This comforted him, but it also devastated him. Because he knew that, at some point, he would have to deal with the presence of the other man. With the shadow of the one who had crossed the line without asking permission. Late in the afternoon, he received a message from Laura. She said that the other man insisted on talking to him, that she wanted a chance to explain, to talk like adults. Daniel, overcome by exhaustion and the need to put an end to that open wound, said he would accept. But he imposed one condition: it would be outside the house, away from the children, and it would be a conversation between just the two of them. The meeting took place in a discreet restaurant, in the middle of the week. Daniel arrived first. He sat at the farthest table and ordered a coffee. When the man entered, their eyes met quickly, but neither of them smiled. He was a tall, well-dressed man with a look of confidence that was too much for someone who had just torn apart a family. He sat down calmly, as if he expected that this moment would be just another routine. Daniel didn't extend his hand, didn't ask how he was. He was direct. He wanted to know when it had started, when Laura had been contacted, why he insisted on getting close to Samuel. The man tried to soften the situation. He said he had never planned anything, that the reunion was an accident, that he had just let himself be carried away by old, unresolved feelings. But Daniel was not impressed by pretty words. He wanted to know if he intended to fight for paternity in court. The man hesitated, then said yes, if necessary. That he didn't want to take Samuel away from Daniel, but that he thought it was fair to be acknowledged. Daniel took a deep breath. He firmly said that he would never allow Samuel to be dragged into a drama he did not choose. That he would protect the boy with everything he had. And that if the man insisted, he would have to face the real father. Not the parent. The father. The man swallowed hard. He looked down. Perhaps, for the first time, he understood who he was dealing with. In the days that followed, Laura withdrew into herself. She spent more time in her room and spoke little. She had lost not only her husband, but herself. He tried to talk to the children, but they also seemed closer to their father. Clara, still young, did not understand what was happening, but she felt it. Samuel, more perceptive, was confused. He noticed the tension, the looks, the silences. One night, after hearing her parents arguing in low voices, she went to Daniel and asked if everything was okay. Daniel, surprised, pulled him close and said that sometimes adults hurt each other unintentionally. But that no matter what happened, he would always be there. Always. Samuel nodded. He hugged his father tightly. And in that moment, Daniel knew that nothing, absolutely nothing, would change what he felt for that boy. Even in the face of betrayal, even in the face of pain, that was love. A week later, Laura decided to leave the house. He said he needed time to reflect, that he was ashamed to be there, that her presence only increased everyone's suffering. Daniel said nothing. He just nodded. She packed a few clothes, said goodbye to the children with tears in her eyes, and left. The house became quieter. Lighter, perhaps. But also sadder. Daniel tried to maintain the routine. He helped with homework, prepared dinner, told bedtime stories. It was exhausting. But it was also a form of healing. A way to rebuild something amidst the rubble. The man never showed up again. Maybe he had understood the limit. Or maybe he had given up. Laura sent sporadic messages, asking about the children. Daniel answered objectively. There was no more room for conversation. Only what was necessary. And it was in this new space, full of pain but also courage, that Daniel began to find something he had not expected. Peace. Not the peace of before, but a new one. The peace of someone who survived. Of someone who had known the worst and chosen to move on. Of someone who had lost everything and still decided to love. Because in the end, despite all the hidden truths, all the broken promises, there was one absolute certainty within him: he was a father. And no one would take that away from him. Not blood, not the past, not betrayal. And this truth would be his strength. From that moment on, everything could start over again. The days that followed were like crossing a field of rubble, where each step required effort and each breath was filled with memories of what had been destroyed. Laura's absence from the house did not translate into immediate relief, but rather into an unexpected, almost uncomfortable emptiness. The space where there had once been conflict was now filled with a thick silence, and although the pain no longer burned with the same intensity as it had at first, it was still there, lodged in the corners of the soul, changing shape but not presence. Daniel began to wake up earlier, prepare coffee more carefully, pack the backpacks with more attention, as if the small routine gestures were bricks placed one by one to rebuild an emotional structure that had collapsed. Living with his children became more intense, more intimate, more genuine. Samuel, unaware of the details, approached his father with a naturalness that reaffirmed, day after day, what Daniel had silently decided: no matter the biological origin, real fatherhood was built with love and presence, and in this he had never failed. There was, however, a dilemma that kept hammering away inside him, a doubt that became clearer as time went by. Should Samuel know the truth or not? To what extent was it fair to keep him in ignorance? Would it be cruel to allow him to grow up unaware of something so fundamental, or would it be crueler to expose him to a truth he had not asked for, had not sought, and that might hurt him forever? Daniel knew that the decision was his alone now. Laura, although she insisted on maintaining some contact, was not clear about what would be best for her son. She visited them rarely, with his permission, in short, monitored meetings. There was shame in her eyes, but also a faint hope that, perhaps with time, something could be rebuilt. Daniel did not harbor this hope. Forgiveness was a concept he did not dismiss, but he did not romanticize it either. Forgiving, for him, was not synonymous with starting over with the person who had destroyed him. It was moving on, without carrying the poison that had almost killed him. Meetings with other people began timidly. First, conversations with mothers from school, then with colleagues from the old reading club he had attended under Laura's influence. One of these people was Helena. A widow for a few years, the mother of a girl in Clara's class, she had a serenity in her eyes and a light humor that contrasted with the weight Daniel still carried. Their conversations began about trivial matters, school schedules, extracurricular activities, problems with teachers. But little by little, the exchange of words became more intense. She talked about the difficulties of raising a daughter alone, about the loneliness of the empty hallways at night, about the fear of getting involved again and repeating old mistakes. He listened, absorbed, and little by little, without realizing it, he began to open up too. Not about everything. Not yet. But enough to feel that there was life beyond the pain. That the heart, even wounded, was still capable of moving. Clara quickly became attached to Helena and her daughter. Samuel, more introspective, took time, but gradually he also got closer. Daniel observed everything cautiously, without rushing, without expectations, but with a spark of hope. Helena didn't ask invasive questions, didn't pressure, didn't demand. She was just there, present, steady, like a silent harbor where he could look when the storm blew again. And she blew. Sometimes at night, when the children were asleep and the house seemed too big. Sometimes when passing by a place she frequented with Laura. Sometimes when hearing a laugh that reminded her of hers. But in those moments, now, there was a new point of support. And that made all the difference. The dilemma of whether or not to tell Samuel the truth remained latent. And Daniel decided to seek professional help. He scheduled sessions with a psychologist who specialized in family dynamics. He explained everything, in detail, without omitting the pain, without dramatizing. He wanted to hear from someone neutral what was the healthiest thing for his son. And the answer, although cautious, was clear: sooner or later, the truth would come out, and the sooner it was told with love, the greater the chance Samuel would have of processing it in a balanced way. But only he could recognize the right moment. It was a decision that required courage, preparation and, above all, emotional stability. Daniel left the session feeling small in the face of the task ahead, but also more aware of the weight of his responsibility. He could not hide behind the protection he believed he offered if, deep down, what he was doing was delaying the inevitable. The following week, he received a letter from Laura. Handwritten, discreetly left in the mailbox. She said she was sorry, but not just for what she had done to him. He said he had reflected deeply and understood that the greatest harm had been done to Samuel. That keeping the boy from the truth was perpetuating a cycle of lies. That she no longer had the strength to be the bridge between worlds. That, if he thought it was right, he should take the lead, tell his son in the way he thought best. And, at the end, she said that, although she had no right to ask for anything, she wanted him to find peace. Daniel read the letter in silence, sitting on the porch, watching the leaves fall from the trees as if they were carrying the remains of a time that would never return. That didn't change anything between them, but it gave him support, an implicit authorization. The dilemma now was action. It was decision. That night, he waited for Samuel to fall asleep. He stayed by his bedside for a few minutes, watching the boy's serene face. He thought about everything they had experienced. Every step, every smile, every difficulty overcome. And there, with his heart in tatters and his soul more mature than ever, he made his decision. Not now. But soon. And when he did, he would do it with love. With truth. With dignity. Because it wasn't about revenge, nor about explosive revelations. It was about respecting that boy's life, about helping him understand who he was without making him feel broken. That would take time. But he had time. He would be by his side. Always. His involvement with Helena grew little by little. Their meetings became more frequent, their glances longer, their silences more comfortable. She didn't demand anything, she didn't invade. He respected her limits, her pain. During a simple dinner, she held his hand across the table and said that if he ever decided to walk with her, she would be there. But she didn't want to be a remedy for old pain. She wanted to be a new love. Daniel smiled lightly for the first time in months. There was something about that woman that healed. And he knew he wasn't ready for everything yet, but he was willing to try. And that, after all, was already a miracle. Meanwhile, Laura remained distant. The children began to ask about her less often. The visits became more spaced out. She, in turn, sought to rebuild her life in silence, far from what she had destroyed. She sent messages, received photos, tried to maintain some connection. But she knew that time was no longer her ally. That the love she had destroyed with her own hands would not be rebuilt with words or promises. Her conscience weighed heavily. But it was a weight that she herself had chosen to carry. And with it, she would have to move on. Because some choices, once made, cannot be undone. Only consequences. And Daniel, now more whole, clearer in his decisions, prepared himself for what was yet to come. The truth with Samuel. The possibility of a new love. The reconstruction of an identity that no longer depended on being a husband, but on being a man. A wounded man, yes, but not defeated. A man who chose to face what hurt, without hiding behind fear. And, above all, a father. Because no one could ever take that away from him. And that was why he was still standing. And that was why, even amidst the wreckage, he could see ahead. Time began to move differently in Daniel's life. The days no longer carried the unbearable weight of discovery, and the nights were no longer haunted by repeated images of betrayal. The wounds were still there, but something inside him was beginning to heal, slowly, like flesh that, even after being cut deeply, finds ways to mend itself. The routine with the children began to flow more smoothly, and even the silences that had previously seemed overwhelming now served as shelter. The weekends, which had long been filled with family obligations barely disguised as leisure, became moments of real connection with his children. Playing in the backyard, watching movies curled up on the couch, talking in the back seat of the car about trivial things, all of this now seemed more precious. It wasn't just about being present, it was about being whole, willing, vulnerable. And in this process, without realizing it, Daniel began to teach his children something that he himself was only just learning, that it is possible to survive pain without stopping loving. Laura's visits, although authorized, began to become increasingly spaced out, as if she herself understood that that space no longer belonged to her. On the few times she went home to see her children, she made a point of maintaining a measured, almost rehearsed posture, avoiding prolonged conversations with Daniel, limiting herself to basic, polite contact, as if she knew she had crossed the line of what was acceptable and no longer wanted to return to center stage. On one of these visits, after putting Clara to bed and preparing a quick snack for Samuel, she sat in the living room while the boy played. She looked around and was surprised by how organized the house was, by the drawings stuck to the refrigerator, by the toys stored in labeled boxes, by the lightness that she had not recognized when she still lived there. Daniel entered the living room and, upon seeing her there, did not react abruptly. He simply sat down in the armchair, keeping a respectful distance. She took a deep breath, looking at her hands before speaking. She said she could see that he was doing well, that the children seemed fine, that he seemed calmer. Daniel didn't answer right away. He just watched her, as if searching for some trace of sincerity that she still had left in her words. Then, in a direct tone, he said that he was doing everything he could to keep the children emotionally stable. Laura nodded slightly, and then stood up. Before leaving, she turned and said, in a choked voice, that she hoped he would find the happiness that she had not been able to give him. He didn't answer. But he didn't look away either. That same weekend, Daniel was invited by Helena to dinner at her house. It was the first time they would be together in a more intimate setting, away from the eyes and school schedules, without their children around. He hesitated before accepting, not for lack of desire, but for fear of not being ready. But he ended up going. He arrived with a bottle of wine in his hands, and was greeted by Helena with a smile that warmed his insides. Her house was small, but full of details that spoke of her personality, paintings with inspiring phrases, books stacked in the corners, photos of her daughter in simple moments, well-tended plants on the windowsills. During dinner, the conversation flowed lightly. They laughed, talked about childhood, fears, about the paths life takes when we least expect it. In a more serious moment, Helena asked if he thought he was ready to love again. Daniel answered honestly. He said he still didn't know what it was that he felt for her, but that there was something. Something that made him feel good, that calmed him. And that if she didn't hurry, he was willing to find out. She smiled. She didn't answer. She just reached across the table and held his hand for a few seconds, a gesture that said more than any words. In the midst of this new beginning, something unexpected happened. Samuel had a simple health problem, a bad flu that left him prostrate for a few days. Nothing serious, but enough to bring back old memories and fears. Daniel took care of him with dedication, sleeping next to his bed, controlling his fever, reading stories in a low voice. It was during one of these nights that Samuel, with his eyes half closed due to the fever, asked his father why his mother cried every time she saw him. The question took Daniel by surprise. He sat down next to the bed and tried to find the right words. He said that sometimes people cry when they miss what they lost. Samuel thought for a few seconds before answering that he thought his mother missed him. Daniel looked at him, his heart heavy, and said that, yes, she did. But that there were things that happened between adults that were sometimes difficult to explain. Samuel turned to the side, took his father's hand and asked him to stay there until he fell asleep. Daniel nodded. And that night, he felt a huge weight fall on his chest, but also an almost painful clarity. The boy deserved to know, at some point, the full truth. But not now. Right now, he just needed to know that he was loved. And that he knew. The relationship with Helena evolved slowly but surely. She got to know Daniel's children naturally, without impositions. The children liked her, especially Clara, who embraced her with the spontaneity that only children can have. Samuel was more reserved, but Daniel noticed in his son's gestures a silent acceptance, as if to say, I'm still learning to trust. And that was enough. One Sunday afternoon, while they were walking with the children through a quiet square, Helena stopped to tie her daughter's sneakers and, when she got up, she said to Daniel, almost in a whisper, that she admired the way he was dealing with everything. That she knew that the pain didn't go away overnight, but that he had a rare strength. He looked at her, and in that moment he felt something he hadn't felt for a long time, peace. Not the peace full of questions that he used to hide behind the role of a good husband, but a real peace, built on truth. It was as if, for the first time in a long time, he had found someone who saw him completely, without the need for him to explain himself. Laura, on the other hand, was still absent. She had given up trying to get anything back together with Daniel. There was no more space, and she knew it. Her relationship with her children was fragile, maintained only by tenuous bonds of affection and time spent together during brief visits. She knew that her mother's love still existed, but she also knew that there was no way to recover it in the way she was used to. She needed to rebuild everything from scratch. And that would require time, effort, and humility. There were nights when she found herself looking back at old photos on her cell phone, videos of birthdays, random recordings of moments that, at the time, seemed trivial and now seemed like relics. She missed not only her family, but herself. The woman she had been before the lies, before the selfishness, before the destruction. One rainy night, Helena showed up at Daniel's house with a cake she had made herself. The children were already asleep. They sat at the kitchen table, sharing the cake in silence, with only the sound of the rain hitting the windows. At one point, Helena held his hand and asked if he had forgiven himself yet. Daniel was silent for a few seconds, then replied that he didn't know if there was anything to be forgiven. That he had been faithful, present, honest. But perhaps what he hadn't overcome yet was the guilt for not having realized it sooner, for having believed blindly, for having allowed it all to take root so deeply. Helena looked at him tenderly, squeezed his hand gently, and said that guilt was a dangerous place, and that staying there for too long would only prevent him from experiencing what was yet to come. He didn't answer. But in his silence there was acceptance. And perhaps this was already the beginning of forgiveness. As she left the house that night, Helena said goodbye with a kiss on his forehead. A simple gesture, but full of meaning. And when Daniel closed the door behind her, he felt something different. It wasn't just desire. It was respect. It was admiration. It was love born from a safe place, without illusions. A love that was possible. Real. And so, without rushing, without grand gestures, just with the truth of the days, Daniel continued to rebuild his story. A story where the pain was not erased, but transformed. Where the love he felt for his children was the anchor that kept him strong. Where Helena's presence was proof that the heart can indeed blossom even after being broken. And where, deep down, there was the awareness that, despite everything, he had won. Not by overcoming the betrayal, but by choosing to continue loving. In the right way. For the right reasons. Time, with its cruel and yet generous way, continued to play its role, pushing the days forward like silent waves that wear away even the most solid rocks. The months that passed served to transform the rubble into solid, albeit uneven, ground. Daniel, now with a more attentive gaze and more thoughtful gestures, had become a different man. No longer the one who carried the burden of maintaining a family structure that had been undermined by the shadows of lies, but someone who knew deeply the taste of pain and overcoming. The relationship with Helena blossomed with an impressive naturalness, as nothing was imposed, nothing forced. There was an almost poetic balance between them, she, with the delicacy of someone who respects the silence of the other, and he, with the maturity of someone who learned that love also means listening patiently and speaking carefully. Samuel and Clara now lived with her in a natural, almost organic way, and the house that had previously been marked by the echo of betrayal, became a space of renewed affection. Not without memories, but with room for new stories. It was on a sunny Saturday, after a morning of walking with his children, that Daniel decided the time had come. He sat with Samuel in the backyard, the two of them side by side, the boy with a ball between his knees, his eyes alert, his face serene. Daniel began with a smile, saying that he had something important to tell him, something that would not change anything in the love between them, but that it needed to be said. He spoke calmly, without beating around the bush, but with a tenderness that only real parents know. He told him about his mother's past, about the genetic truth, about how it all happened. Samuel remained silent for what seemed like an eternity. Then, with the precocious maturity of someone who already carried unanswered questions in his eyes, he simply said that he knew something was different, but that he had never doubted who his father was. He hugged Daniel tightly, with a trust that dissolved any trace of fear or guilt. In that hug, there were no more doubts, no secrets. Only the certainty of a bond that had withstood everything. Meanwhile, Laura continued her lonely journey. She had moved to another city, starting over from scratch. Working as a teacher in a public school, she sought redemption in small gestures, she dedicated herself to her students with zeal, participated in volunteer projects, tried to be useful to someone who did not yet know her through past choices. But none of this freed her completely. She carried within her the constant memory of everything she had lost due to a thoughtless decision. She wrote letters to her children that she never sent, kept old drawings, read and reread old messages from Daniel as if she could find a version of herself that no longer existed there. Meetings with her children now happened from time to time, supervised and brief. Samuel, even after learning the whole truth, chose to maintain a respectful relationship with his mother, but always with a distance that hurt her like an invisible punishment. Clara, being small, still expressed affection more freely, but over time, she began to notice the gaps in her mother's silences. Laura's former lover never showed up again. He gave up all claim, perhaps realizing there was no room for him in the life he tried to invade. He disappeared without a trace, like a ghost that only reappears when the darkness is convenient. And just as he arrived, he left, soulless, rootless, loveless. Laura never heard from him again, and perhaps that was the fairest of all possible outcomes. Helena, on the other hand, became not only Daniel's partner, but also his accomplice in the challenges of everyday life. She built a relationship of trust with the children, but never tried to occupy a space that was not hers. She respected Laura's role as a mother, but was firm in protecting the little one's emotional environment. She was the kind of person who knew the value of silence in tense moments and the right word when necessary. And with that, she earned not only Daniel's love, but the admiration of his children, and over time, the privilege of being called family. The last stage of this cycle took place on a summer night, when Daniel, now with grayer hair and a lighter soul, decided to write a letter. It was for Laura. Not to make amends, not to reopen wounds, but to close a chapter. He said he forgave her. Not for her sake, but for his. Because he didn't want to carry any more weight than life already required. He hoped she would find peace, not so she could come back, but so she could be a good mother in her own way. And, most importantly, that she would not forget what she had lost, not as a punishment, but as a reminder that love, when betrayed, becomes an abyss from which few can escape. He put the letter in the mail without remorse, and in doing so, he felt as if he had finally buried a body he had been carrying for too long. That same month, he asked Helena to marry him. A simple proposal, on a normal afternoon, while they were washing the dishes together. She laughed, thinking he was joking, but when she saw Daniel's firm gaze, she cried. He said yes with teary eyes, trembling hands and a smile that said more than any words. They got married discreetly, in a small ceremony, surrounded by close friends, their children and an energy that was not grandiose, but everything was real. The party was held in the backyard, with lights strung between the trees, soft music and new memories being created to overshadow the old ones. Daniel now walked with his head held high, no longer because he needed to appear strong, but because he was. And not because he had not fallen, but because he had gotten up after the most painful fall of his life. He built a family where there had been ruins before, and taught his children that love is not about never making mistakes, but having the courage to start over when everything falls apart. His story was not about perfection, but about overcoming. And that was enough. If you've made it this far, comment below what you thought of this story. Your opinion is very important to us. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel to receive more stories like this, real, intense stories, with impactful endings and lessons that make us reflect. This story showed, once again, how betrayal doesn't just destroy relationships. It destroys dreams, affection, memories, and the future. It hurts not only the person being betrayed, but also the person who betrays, because it corrodes the essence, destroys the truth, and creates invisible scars that not even time can completely erase. Here, on our channel, we do not support and will never support any type of betrayal. All the stories told here are fictional, but created to reflect the real weight of the consequences that betrayal imposes. Remember, the truth hurts, but lies destroy. Be honest with those who walk with you. Because trust, when broken, never returns to the same place. And love, when hurt too much, learns to live without you.